ends up on YouTube, Michael?
Perfectly great with that, yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. That's one person's consent recorded. Obviously, you can withdraw at any point as well. Of course, I'm sure your talk will go very well, but you may want to revise it at the end. I'm sure you won't.
Right. If it falls apart catastrophically, I'll be sure to reach out.
Absolutely. Okay, we have just a few more moments until we reach the hour, but there's no harm in me starting to witter on for a few minutes. We've got quite a few people in the room already. This is our final recorded session of the 8th Mathsport International Conference, taking place online this year, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been a fantastic conference given the constraints of having to be online. Thank you to everybody who has contributed. Our final session is dubbed a Roses session, and if you're not sure what Roses stands for, it stands for the Reading Online Sport Economics Seminars. These are something that we've been running from Reading since March last year, and so this is something like the 59th week that we've run them over that time. It's been a fantastic resource for many to access research on a regular basis from your own desk, living room, wherever you happen to be, back garden, and we have a schedule running through to September, and we'll probably go on into the autumn as well. So if you do want to be involved, please do let me know. Reach out, and I'll happily add you to the team. They take place at 2:30 UK time every Friday in this exact format. And there's an hour and a half talk with plenty of time for speaking and Q&A. So this week, given that we're within the Mathsport conference, it's a slightly different format. We've got 3 talks. Each talk has about 40 minutes, and we've got a fascinating range of talks in prospect. We've got cycling, followed by cricket, followed by hockey. So I'm personally very much looking forward to it, and I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to witter on too much longer, other than to say, please keep your microphones on mute for the duration of Michael's talk. Please, if you have questions for clarification, feel free to raise your hand and I'll interrupt Michael. But if not, please park more substantive questions for the end. Michael will talk for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be 10 minutes time for Q&A at the end. So, Michael, please do take away your talk. Thank you very much.
For sure. Let me get my screen share going. Let me know if you can see this.
Yep, got that.
And
yep, perfect.
Great. Do you see the presenter view though?
No, see the normal view.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Michael Smith. I am a research analyst.
Sorry, Michael, you've now gone into the presenter view though.
Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can figure out how to get that present normally.
You start when you hit the present button, it went normally. So that's the normal view.
Okay, great. Yes, my name is Michael Smith. I am a research analyst at Economist Incorporated. It is an economic consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And the question I'm interested in today is there a home road advantage in men's professional cycling? Now, more than potentially any group in the world, I think this group does not have to have home advantage explained to them. But I would like to go over some of the causes of home field advantage so we can investigate those with regards to men's professional cycling. As noted by Neville and Holder in 1999, home field advantage, particularly in team sports, can be broken down into 4 main factors. The impact of the crowd of spectators, familiarity of the athletes with local conditions, the travel conditions those athletes take getting to the event, and advantages that may be built in through the sports rulebook. So let's look at that last cause. From my opinion, reading the research, it appears to be the consensus that a lot of the times rules tend to be very fair between home and away teams in a way that makes it potentially the weakest of the four causes to explain the differences between home and away teams and the advantage that home teams have over away teams. Because most large international sports tend to have somewhat impartial rule books, at least in principle, where there's not a structural advantage for the home team because they want to have competitive fairness. And cycling is not obviously different in that respect. But even in sports where there is the potential advantage for the home team built into the rule book, like college or professional baseball, where the last team, the home team, gets to bat last, having an informational advantage to score as many runs as they need in order to win if they are not already in the lead. These sports don't have too much evidence that this structural component really gives a decisive edge between winners and losers. And that brings us to a second potential reason, local familiarity. And this one seems much more sport dependent. It appears that environmental familiarity of the athletes with their local surroundings plays a somewhat minor role in explaining home field advantage across many teams and sports. This appears to be mostly due to the fact that professional sports have standardized areas of competition where a baseball diamond changes very infrequently, maybe a few dozen feet here or there, or a soccer pitch is fairly regulated. A football field is the exact same dimensions across all NFL teams. But there are some environmental outliers that may provide advantages or disadvantages to home competitors. For example, it's been found that in English soccer, playing on artificial turf have an advantage over teams that play on traditional grass pitches, or at least back in 1993. Meanwhile, competition across many sports can be impacted by high altitude. For example, a famous example here in the United States is the NFL's Denver Broncos Mile High Stadium, where the elevation is over 5,000 feet. And that allows field goal attempts to be succeeded at a much higher rate than they would at a typical lower altitude field. And this could potentially play a huge role in professional cycling, as the local knowledge of roads by local riders can be potentially crucial benefit, because they may know how to go around a certain corner on a road a little bit better. They know how to dole out their energy over the course of a race, to know when they should try to hold back and reserve because the road up in front is very difficult and they know they need to keep energy in the tank. Or some riders know what's the best time to go on the attack, where they can have a quick burst of energy, get over a hump in the road, and then try to make a break for it. And so there is potential that local familiarity can play a big role in men's professional cycling. The third option is for describing how home field advantage may come about is travel. And especially across time zones, travel can hurt athletic performance. Much of the research finds that their linear distance traveled by away teams is of at least of some importance, like in baseball and in basketball. But the worst impact appears to be on athletic performance when athletes have to change time zones. Specifically, it's been found that this is the case in soccer World Cup classifications and qualifications, and it's also found in Major League Baseball. Specifically, there is a significant disadvantage for away teams who have to travel across time zones, at least 3 time zones, or who are traveling from the West Coast to the East Coast. However, this seems unlikely to be too big of an impact for men's professional cycling, as many cyclists arrive well ahead of time to these races, especially for big events like Grand Tours, where cyclists can get to the race days or sometimes even weeks in advance, potentially undermine the potential impact of travel because they have more time to acclimate to the new sleep schedule and to the new environment going on practice rides. But that brings us to the fourth and potentially final reason why there might be home field advantage in men's professional cycling, and that is the effect of crowds. Now, the effect of crowds in the literature on team sports performance is twofold. You could think of the crowd of spectators influencing the rulings made by the referees or the officials during the game, or it can be impacting directly the performance of the athletes. For example, a crowd of spectators, particularly the noise they produce in the middle of a game or competition, can serve as somewhat of a cue to referees when making calls that can change the game state of the competition. There's these partisan spectators, and this bias within the crowd for the home team can thus somewhat filter down to the decisions of the officials, leading to potentially fewer disciplinary actions, for example, yellow or red cards in soccer or football, and in basketball, the differences between flagrant 1 and flagrant 2 fouls. There's also a specifically apparent bias in referees that can be categorized as ruminators, referees who tend to take a lot of time to reflect heavily on uncertain calls that can be really impacted by the crowd's noise. And this seems less likely to be the case in men's professional cycling, as race referees are typically situated in ivory towers in some way, where they are in a car separated from fans, they are in a motorcade, or they are in a off-site building. And usually the big decisions that can impact whether a rider is disqualified or any other type of punishment is determined in those somewhat ivory towers, and typically after the race is completed. And there's very rare occasions where the proceedings are stopped mid-race, and usually those are conditions that cannot be affected by the crowd. Potentially, you could have a crowd that would stop riders from riding during maybe a protest, but that seems unlikely to be the reason for a home field advantage. Many times these situations come up when there is a mudslide that cuts off the road, or there is a train that prevents cyclists from going across the road because the train is cutting off their way to get across the other side. But it may seem much more likely that this impact can be found on the performance of the athletes themselves. While there's been mixed evidence about whether individual players have different performance levels when facing different types of cheers and jeers and silence, different types of crowd noises, there have been early results from natural experiments due to the onset of COVID-19 that have reduced the, one second, let me just get rid of this reminder, thank you. There's artificially that constrained the crowd sizes, specifically in professional German soccer. This has suggested that there's been a reduction in crowd size that has reduced the home field advantage only for the top tier teams who may be used to larger audiences, but I'm sure there's been a lot more research into the effects of COVID-19 on professional sports over the past few months. So I'm definitely willing to update my belief in that. But there's potential in men's cycling for crowds to have a huge impact. As I'm sure plenty of you are aware, spectators in cycling are notoriously loud, they're very passionate, and there's usually very little room between the cyclist and the spectator, sometimes as close as millimeters, where a cyclist is going up a mountain road and you can see almost like a Red Sea of cycling fans splitting in either direction. And this intimate relationship, especially the cheering and the rabid fervor and passion of the home team, of the fans that may be rooting for local riders or fan favorites, can potentially have a huge impact. So that brings us to an interesting conclusion about men's professional cycling, and it's that calculating home advantage is very difficult, and that's because of the unique circumstances brought by the sport itself. Cycling in many ways is a very weird sport. Unlike most sports, road cycling does not have a home and away system of contests. Many times in most races, there are actually several teams competing against one another. There are also incredible variability in stages of road cycling, not only across editions of a given race from year to year, but also between stages, where some days there is a stage that is completely pan flat, and the main importance is the wind and you protecting yourself and sheltering yourself from the disadvantage of wind hitting you right on your face. While other stages, the wind has no impact basically whatsoever, because you're going up these huge Pyrenean, mountains in the Pyrenees or the Alps. There's also a difficult and interesting multi-agent process in professional cycling, because these road cycling teams or the cyclists that comprise those teams don't truly compete purely one-on-one, and they have different incentives and goals. They also have a plethora of different race types. You have the one-day classics like Liège-Bastogne-Liège or Paris-Roubaix or Milan-San Remo, all the way up to 3-week grand tours, the Giro d'Italia, the Tour de France, and the Vuelta a España. And like I mentioned earlier, there's these different incentive structures for both riders and teams. Maybe on any given day, a cyclist wants to try to win this specific stage. Or if they have hopes for the general classification, they may try to hold on energy for more difficult stages down the road. Or if you are a new cyclist on the block, or you are part of a small team that's just lucky to be at a Grand Tour, you might just be trying to maximize overall airtime to prove to your sponsors that they made the right decision sponsoring you. Compared to other sports, there are no home stadiums or arenas with professional road cycling, with potentially the exception of stages that begin or end in velodromes. And this prevents the easily accessible gate receipt data, let alone a way to verifiably estimate which teams bystanders are rooting for. And so this causes some difficulty in calculating home advantage in men's professional cycling. These unique set of conditions make us ask ourselves a lot of questions about how we go about even calculating this advantage. Should the home field advantage be considered based on where the team is based or where the rider is based? And if we are focused on the rider level, is their home the area they live, where they practice most frequently, or even where they grew up and maybe were familiar during their times as amateur? What is even considered a win versus a loss in the first place, given that there may be numerous goals for a rider or a team that they can have on any given day? And this difficulty in calculating home field advantage has not stopped cyclists from believing that there is an edge given to them by riding on their home roads. Two big examples recently was that before the Tour of Colombia, American TJ Van Garderen noted that the home field advantage is going to be very much in play, end quote, for his Colombian teammates, who went on to place first and second overall, coincidentally. And similar luck was had by former world champion Lizzie Deignan, who called the route of the 2020 edition of La Course a home race for her, the day before she won the race in a photo finish. Now, of course, this anecdotal evidence is of little use empirically for determining the true existence of home field advantage, as riders may only bring up the advantage when they know that they or their teammates are in particularly good form, and therefore it cannot be reliably used as a way to analyze whether there is home road advantage in men's professional cycling. And that's why there's potential little research being done on home advantage in cycling. One of the only pieces of empirical research on home advantage within professional cycling comes from a presentation given at an early edition of the Mathsport Asia Conference by Sarath and Hausen, using cycling quotient points, which are distributed to riders based on their rank in a given race, adjusted for the difficulty and the race type. That got this data set from CQranking.com for the years of 2011 to 2018. And they found a statistically significant home country advantage for riders participating in the World Tour cycling events. Now, my research tries to build on this paper and this work in two main ways. First, by adding several explanatory variables that try to strengthen the robustness of the underlying model, and by having more granular location data that allows for a kind of proximity statistic to be calculated, where we can consider how close a rider is to their home based on the city level rather than the country level. However, this analysis is more limited in the fact that I am only using data from the Grand Tours. So like I mentioned earlier, the Giro d'Italia, the Vuelta a España, and the Tour de France. Whereas the cycling quotient points allows for analysis of all World Tour events, which the 3 Grand Tours are only a small subset, but a very important subset, to say the least. So looking at the methods of coming about to calculate home field advantage, I first utilized a data set provided to me by cyclingranking.com that contains the stage-by-stage results of each edition of the 3 Grand Tours between 1998 and 2019 to investigate the magnitude of this advantage, if any, for riders racing closer to home. As you'll see in the first table to the right, we have 22 editions for all 3 races, and there are at least 160 riders for each stage of these editions of the 3 Grand Tours. Usually, a race has between 180 and 205, maybe 210 riders, but that can change on a year-to-year basis. Overall, it is a very large sample size with tens of thousands of rider stage combinations. I used an empirical model that uses the distance between the finish line of a given stage and the birthplace of a given Grand Tour racer, while controlling for other independent variables like the race that they're riding on, the stage number, the stage distance, the number of riders who are crossing the finish line, and a dummy variable for the riders themselves. As you will see, these race stages are broken down into 5 main categories. You have generic stages, mountain stages, prologues, which are like individual time trials, but they are very short and they must be at the very beginning of a stage race. You have sprint stages where a bunch of riders cross the finish line, typically in one large block. And you have individual time trials where one rider is, quote unquote, riding against the clock to compete individually. Now, I want to be clear that I excluded team time trials from these calculations, where similar to an individual time trial, there is one entity competing by itself without the influences of competitors, but team time trials have the complexity of having multiple teammates competing with one another to get across the finish line as quickly as possible, which creates a lot of complexity about how you determine where the home of a team is, especially given the fact that only 4 riders traditionally have to cross the finish line at any given point in order to get the time for the entire team. And that causes a lot of difficulty. And so in this analysis, team time trials and stages without full results were dropped. And the stages without full drops are stages that were ended either earlier or had a raced in a non-competitive fashion, either due to maybe rider protest or in an honor of respect for a fallen rider. All of those stages were removed from the data set. And I used birthplace as a proxy for what a rider might consider their home turf, as birthplace is more easily accessible and consistent within a rider's timeline than maybe their current address or where their team is registered. And calculating these statistics allows an interesting site where you can have the 70,000 or so data points within each Grand Tour. And the average cyclist is about 2,000 kilometers away from their hometown, from the finish line of the stage. Now, some of them are very close. As you can see here, there are several cyclists who fall within having their hometown be the finish line of the stage. But there are some that are on the exact opposite side of the world. You can imagine a European race that has a cyclist from New Zealand or Southern Australia, where you get up into the 2,000 kilometer range. I will want to point out a note on proximity, because there are, in my view, 2 main ways you can try to analyze proximity between a rider's birthplace and where they're racing. Simply using a linear distance between a rider's birthplace and the destination of a stage maybe undersells the importance of home field advantage. For example, you can imagine that it is doubtful that a rider who is born 1,000 kilometers away from the finish line of a given stage can be considered more of a local than a rider who is born 1,200 kilometers away, at least on that metric alone, while a rider who was born only 25 kilometers away may have substantial returns compared to a rider who is a more distant 50 kilometers away from the finish line. And that might not be accurately reflected in a model that uses linear distance alone. Thus, I believe it is important to also consider binary interpretations of distance and proximity between rider birthplace and stage destination. So to achieve this end, this work analyzes models that interpret distance to higher degrees as binary indicators, with cutoffs of 10 and 25 kilometers, and then also 50, 100, 250, 500, 1,000, 2,500, and 5,000. And you can see the statistics on these rider stages and which ones fall into these dummy variable buckets in the table below, where approximately 0.1% of all rider stages have a combination of a rider who was born within 10 kilometers of the finish line, and it dramatically goes up to where when you reach 5,000 kilometers, nearly 87% of riders fall within that bucket of being within 5 kilometers of the finish line of a given stage. And only 13% of those fall outside. So with that note out of the way, we have to ask ourselves, what is being tested? Because of the different goals that a cyclist or a team can be in search of. This work employs several different ways of estimating home field advantage in men's road cycling, particularly in multi-stage races like the Grand Tours. Multi-performance indicators, I believe, are necessary. And so I use 4 dependent variables. Stage rank, where a rider finished compared to all other riders in a cardinal listing. The time gap to the winner in minutes, so how many minutes or seconds behind you were compared to the stage winner. That same time gap as a percentage of the stage winner's time, and the speed from beginning to end of the rider in kilometers per hour.
Michael, can I just tell you, you've got about 5 minutes left?
Yes.
Great. Thanks.
So first, we'll look at this proximity model that uses both linear, squared, and cubed interpretation of proximity, not using those dummy variables, but simply just the distance between the finish line and the stage, and the rider's birthplace. Now you can see that these statistics are fairly significant when put into megameters. So for every 1,000 kilometers that a cyclist is closer to the stage result, they can expect roughly 5 to 6 additional places in rank. But rank is a very noisy statistic, especially on sprint stages where riders are going across the finish line all at one certain time. And this impact is somewhat reduced when looking at the other dependent variables of gap percentage, and speed. Now, I would like to note that it does appear that over time, home field advantage by year is increasing, which could be a huge benefit to modern cyclists versus past. It also seems to be affected by where in the race, whether it's the beginning or end of the race, and how long a certain stage is, especially when considering the gaps between a rider and the winner of a stage, where distance can provide a large statistically significant effect. But like noted earlier, it may be beneficial to look at a dummy variable model. Specifically here, we have a 10-kilometer dummy variable model. And you can see that there is a very statistically significant 10 rank advantage for riders who are considered local using the 10-kilometer cutoff. That is also found in the advantage for a cyclist in gap to the rider, either in percentage or absolute terms. But it does not appear to be the case for speed. And I believe this is the case because, as mentioned earlier, very few cyclists fall into the 10-kilometer bucket. Only 10% of 1% of cyclists fall into that category. And so it may be a benefit to look into the 25-kilometer model instead. As you can see here, the coefficients are very similar, sometimes even greater, for the 25-kilometer dummy variable model, where a rider who is considered local by this cutoff potentially places 15 places out of 100 or 200 riders better, and can reduce a full 2 minutes in their average gap to the winner of a stage, or 1% of the total stage time, and potentially half a kilometer per hour faster. These are fairly significant, and I would argue fairly impressive results to see in a model considering the difficulties of calculating this home field advantage. But 25 and 10 still have very few riders in them. And so it may be beneficial to look at further dummy variables like 50, 100, all the way to 2,500 and 5,000. And so presented here are the results for those different cutoffs. For simplicity and brevity's sake, all of the other independent variables that are used in the models have been whisked away, and these are just summary results. If anyone would like to see the model results for each individual cutoff, please let me know. And overall, I would like to just add a quick analysis by looking at further interpretations of the data by Grand Tour and by stage type. So if any of you are cycling fans and are interested of whether this result holds more primarily in the Giro or the Tour or the Volta, it appears to be the fact that home field advantage is very strong in Italy in the Giro d'Italia, and that home field advantage is much more important in mountain stages versus sprints or time trials, which makes sense because there is a lot more variability in who finishes on a mountain stage during what time, where there can be gaps of minutes upon hours, where a sprint stage usually has just a few riders all going at one time in that large block. Again, time trials in Figure 6 refer exclusively to individual non-prologue time trials. So in conclusion, there appears to be substantial evidence that men's professional cycling road cyclists perform better when riding close to their birthplace, at least in stage races like the Grand Tours. I believe expanding this data set to shorter stage races or one-day classics, particularly those held outside of Europe, could help determine if this advantage is more generalizable. Data on national road race championships, where all riders are of the same citizenship of that country, could specifically aid in teasing out the pure proximity-driven home field advantage potentially found in the sport. Additional data on participating races like the age and team of a rider at a given stage could be beneficial. Potentially using bib number as rough proxy for what position a rider holds on the team, whether they are the overall hope for the general classification or whether they are a simple domestique. That could be beneficial in improving the explanatory power of these models at the least. Race environmental variables like the number of categorized climbs, total altitude gain, or crosswind speed could also be of potential use. But you also want to be careful to not obscure the impact of home field advantage by including these constituent factors in the models themselves. Potentially, these factors could be part of why local riders do better. In a similar way, weather patterns and road quality might blur the line between explanatory and a fundamental component of home road advantage. I know I'm going a little bit over time, so I'll finish up here. There are natural experiments in the sport. For specifically, we can imagine COVID-19 and the limitations on fans could potentially help distinguish the various components of home field advantage and their relative weights. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, and I would be totally open to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. Very interesting talk. Do we have any questions? Phil, raising a hand the old-fashioned way. You're on mute. You're on mute still, Phil.
Few observations rather than questions because I'm conscious of the time. Listening to your talk made me think about the term home advantage. And it occurs to me, actually, perhaps it's not an advantage that these riders are getting. They're just trying harder. It's just an observation, really. And this brings me to football, really. To what extent, you know, it's home advantage. Okay, you're playing at home. Do you try harder, or are you genuinely getting assistance from outside, e.g. the referee? But anyway.
Right. For sure. I mean, you can imagine that, you know, there's a lot of incentives for French cyclists to, you know, win the Tour de France one day, and they've been waiting for 30 years, and they can put in a lot more effort, as we've seen over the past, you know, 10 editions.
Yeah, and I think
continuously failing.
Can I just, again, I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to make a point about the mounting stages appearing to have a greater home advantage. That again indicates to me that it's an effort rather than the assistance, because effort pays more in the mountain stages than it does on the flat stages, perhaps anyway. So.
Yeah, I think that very well could be the case. It could also be You could argue, though, that the crowds of spectators on mountain stages are much more passionate because there's not the barricades keeping them around. They have spent, a few hours, trekking up the mountain to be there. They write the cyclist's name on the road. They're cheering with their flags, while sprints are, so compiled at the end that, I could definitely see effort being a big portion of that, where maybe it's not a structural advantage. It's just that they put in more effort when they're near home.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Any more questions? Leonard.
Yeah, very nice presentation. I'm just wondering one thing, if you accounted also for the fact that, for example, there are certain countries that have, strongest cyclists compared to others. For example, if you look at Belgian cyclists or French, you'll see a lot of names, but then, I don't know, if you go to Russia, there's going to be obviously less names. And then if you have these races happening in the same countries where many of those cyclists come from, then probably you could see some bias there, I guess.
For sure. If, out of the 200 riders of the Tour de France, 100 of them are French, and there's a lot lower barrier to entry, right? They could potentially pull off a surprise win that could skew the data in a way that would be potentially unfair, where maybe like at Wimbledon, British tennis players might appear to perform better just because they have more opportunities. I think that's very true in men's professional cycling because it is such a heavily European sport with, maybe a handful of riders from South America and from Oceania. But yeah, I think that could be a huge impact, and potentially why that there was, I don't know if you noticed, there was actually statistical significance at the 5,000 kilometer mark, which I did not originally expect, which may imply, because if you plot a 5,000 kilometer radius around Europe, it basically entire encapsulates the continent, but almost nothing else, which may imply that there may be language barriers or there may be just higher barriers to entry for riders who are not from the European continent, or specifically from Western Europe, specifically with the four big countries of cycling.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Leonard. I'm going to nip in with a question. Oh, yes, no, that's just Leonard's hand. What about the team dynamics? I don't know if I missed that from your talk, Michael, but I understand cyclists perform in teams, and then there's also obviously team dynamics there. And what you're essentially looking at is how close one member of the team is to home.
Right.
Does that influence what the other team members will do? Will they support that team member that's near home to get a good performance near to home? And do you take account of that?
For this model, I did not take account of that. That's a very interesting dynamic. You could imagine, especially like if a team was doing a race that is very close to their sponsor or is near their practice facilities, that could potentially be a huge benefit. There is a lot of dynamics, especially in these large grand tours where some of the riders are not there competing for themselves, and that can definitely potentially understate home road advantage. You could also imagine if you were trying to get on air, get airtime, being on TV, you could be a cyclist that goes in a breakaway for hours on end, so people will show your jersey on screen. But then because you spend all that energy, you actually end up 200th place, 10 minutes behind the winner, because you were putting all the effort trying to impress your local sponsors. And so, yeah, this could definitely be incorporated using team or sponsorship variables. I was not able to incorporate that in my model, but I think it potentially would increase the coefficients found on home advantage in men's professional cycling.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Good time for one final question for Michael, if anyone has one.
I just realized my camera was not on for the past 5 minutes. My apologies.
That's okay. It seems to happen. It's an odd thing where when people share their screen, often the camera goes off automatically. There we go. Well, it looks like we don't have any further questions. So in which case, I think I can say thank you, Michael. A really interesting talk. I think, interesting stuff in terms of home advantage in cycling. I hadn't really thought about it before. And, that issue of the extent to which it is an effort, versus the other things that you were looking at. So thank you very much. Really interesting.
I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me speak.
We're going to move on. Actually, we can use the Teams applause function, which I saw at least one person was doing, to give Michael a virtual round of applause. We're going to move on to our second talk of the session, which is by Moinak Bhaduri on detecting structural breaks in cricket run scoring through sequential time-switched hypotheses tests. So, Moinak, do you want to share your slides and get going?
That is indeed quite a mouthful, the title. My apologies
That's
for
okay.
that. But James, you need to... let's see. Where do I go?
If you have a leave button top right of your screen, then you can hit the button next to the leave button to share your presentation.
I have a tiny arrow. It says open
Yeah.
share tray.
Yep, that's the one, yep.
I can't quite seem to find. I do have it open though. Bottom plots,
Yeah.
PowerPoint.
It tends to get shoved down further down the list of the less recently you had that window active.
Okay, let's see. That should tie screen, tab. Alrighty. How is this?
Got your files, your Windows Explorer. Can see your
but not my
PowerPoint
PDF.
file. Sorry, your PDF. Sorry, yeah, is it? Yeah, it is PDF, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
You might have shared the wrong window, but if you on your computer go to the window that you've got the PDF open in, then
how about now?
No, you've unshared now. So if you reshare and share specifically the PDF viewer window, that should work.
Right. Any good now?
Not seeing anything yet.
Desktop window.
You might do better to share your desktop, then you can just navigate to the window itself.
Okay. I do see.
Right, you can see your Teams, and that's because you're in a. If you shared your Windows Explorer.
Do we have it now?
No, I can just see Teams still.
That's quite strange, though. Hang on.
Back to your Windows Explorer window. So if you double click on the PDF, see what happens then.
That is what I did. So I can see it at my end. I can see the PDF, but not the. I do see the PDF, but.
So when you go to the share tray, you might have the option to just share your desktop rather than sharing a specific window or your screen. It might be better just to do that, because that way we see your whole screen rather than
when I go to share my desktop, I have an option of entire screen. But the trouble is I cannot move on to share. It's stuck on cancel.
Okay, an alternative is that you... No, I see your Teams again. An alternative is if you want to send me your slides, I can share them on your behalf.
Still not.
Oh, there we go. No, got them.
Oh,
there we
perfect.
go.
Perfect.
So try full screen now. Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. So sorry about all that.
That's okay.
So at the outset, I need to thank James for organizing everything, despite the virus and despite all the. I'm Moinak Bhaduri, an assistant professor in the Math Science Department at Bentley University in Massachusetts, and I am, in just a little while, going to describe to you a way in which you can attach numbers right? A way in which you can attach figures and numbers to a largely qualitative idea, a largely subjective notion of how interesting a cricket match has been, especially a limited over cricket match like a T20 or a one-day international has been. Traditional tools such as the margin of victory, the run deficit, how long did the game last, those quantities, they are often too oversimplified and they do not always do a good job. And also in addition, you have to wait for the entire match to be over to calculate them. So in just a little bit, we're going to propose a fresh alternative for which the first part of the talk could be a little technical, but please bear with me. I normally work on change detection in continuous time point process observations, and today I need to use a special subclass of it, the self-exciting subclass, where one event triggers or untriggers several others in a very close neighborhood. Several observations, several natural and artificial phenomena, they fit this premise, they fit this context. Very often we find, for instance, a major earthquake causing several aftershocks. Gang violence could be another example where one attack as if causes several retaliations over the next few days. In a cricketing context, we find very frequently that the dismissal of one batsman as if causing wickets to fall in clusters. Right? So through this work, we're trying to check whether changes have happened both in the way the major and the minor events emerge as time goes on. So I need to quickly take you back to the way these stories normally modeled. We assume that there is a nice mathematical function called the intensity function, shown here through lambda, that controls the instantaneous probability of observing at least one shark, maybe one run, over a very small window of time. Specifying the intensity is not enough to describe the system entirely. We must also know something about the underlying law, the distribution. So if that law happens to be Purcell, meaning if the probability of observing a given number of runs by a given time period is expressed according to that Purcell expression, then the process will be a Purcell process, and this is how the intensity function enters the system as the rate of a Purcell variable. So the underlying Purcell distribution and the intensity function teaming together, they drive the entire mechanism. And in this work, we're trying to question the nature of this lambda function, right? Especially whether it's a constant function independent of time. Graphically, that would lead to this kind of a monotonic flow of shocks. Intervals of the same length are likely to contain the same number of cricket runs, no matter where you are on the innings. If, on the other hand, your intensity increases, then as time goes on, you'd expect more and more runs, and your process will be deteriorating. As our alternate choice of the underlying intensity, we felt that this expression, shown here through equation 1, does a very good job at explaining this self-exciting property, where through the blue piece, the first term that is, you're describing how your major events happen, and through your green function, that describes how your minor events, the aftershocks, as if they emerge as time goes on. You'll find that this is a data-dependent intensity. These y values are represent the times at which runs get scored. And depending on the choice of your green memory kernel, you'll have different interpretations of this forgetting the past property. A very common choice of this memory kernel is the exponential function, where a high value of beta, that guy, will tell you that you're forgetting the past very, very fast. Your memory decays very rapidly, while a very low value of beta will tell you have a long memory. That is, maybe the dismissal of a batsman has a very long-lasting effect on how future runs get scored. Okay, now how much history is relevant to your problem, how much history is worth recalling, and how much is worth forgetting, that is controlled by this window of size R. And here we have worked with the most general structure of an infinite past that leads to a Hawkes process kind of a structure. So again, through this work, we're trying to check primarily whether changes have happened in both colors, in both the blue and the green pieces as time goes on. In the context of a cricket match, a change in the blue piece could be because of something external or exogenous to the system. maybe the enforcing or the lifting off of power plays, while changes in the green portion could be because of something internal or endogenous to the system. Maybe because of bowlers starting to bowl better lines and lengths, which may have nothing at all to do with the power plays. Okay. So here's a quick simulation graphic that describes what kind of intensities could lead to what kind of data. To your left, you have a data-independent deterministic intensity, where something that you can write out prior to observing your data. Remember, the intensity function tells you how rapidly runs get scored. Okay, and a spike in that kind of an intensity would lead to a clear crowding. This time to your right, which is easily visible. In contrast, to your right-hand side, you have a data-dependent random intensity, very similar to number 1 that you saw the previous page. And this intensity goes up every time a new observation comes in, every time you score a run, that is. And you would admit that changes in this intensity, they're harder to detect. They were placed at 50 and 75, but if you look at the data panel, those are harder to detect. Those are not as vivid, as clear as the ones to your left. So through this work, we're trying to look at the top panel, the data panel, the run scoring panel. Each spike here represents a run being scored. We're trying to look at those panels, and we're trying to infer, we're trying to guess whether changes have happened in the data generation mechanism in the underlying intensity, primarily, okay? Assuming there is a change at all. I mean, one way, there could be loads of ways, but one way to do just that, to check whether there is at all a change, could be through the first function, the first fraction that you see over there, the z fraction, which is extremely well known in the literature. It's known to lead to a class of optimal tests. It's expressed as a linear combination of the log of the time ratios. The TIs represent the times at which you're scoring runs in terms of balls. Another option is where you can keep the same structure, right? The same log structure, but you're simply switching the ratios about to 1. Okay. So Z and ZB, they're exact opposites of each other. And because of the way log functions work, it isn't hard to show that a deteriorating sequence, meaning observations or patterns that happen towards the end of a cricket innings during the slog overs, when they're trying to score more runs very fast, those types of processes will inflate the value for ZB and will deflate the value for Z. Okay. In more recent times, we have worked with the maximums and the minimums of these two versions, and we found them to have quite good classification power. And now we're trying to check whether the sum of the power will translate to the harder scenario of a self-exciting intensity. This is an answer to that question, basically a 3D power study, where along the wall, along the vertical axis, along the z-axis, that is, you have the probability of correct classification, essentially. So this number 40% tells you if you have those pre and post change beta combinations, then you would expect to detect a self-exciting process as a self-exciting process 40% of the times using those different tools, the 4 different tools that you just saw. Okay, so you've noticed there is a clear asymmetry about the diagonal. One thing is expected along the diagonal on the floor when the pre and the post change beta parameters are very similar to each other. Detection is understandably very hard, which is why you have a valley in these power mountains. But along the edges, when they're very, very dissimilar, when they're very, very different, the pre-change piece and the post-change piece, they're very different from each other. Detection is very simple, it's very easy, which is why along those edges you have a big height. Those mountains are pretty steep, okay? So that is expected, but the trouble here is you do not have a clear symmetry about the diagonal. You've noticed that most of this top portion, the maximal power, is generated by L most of the times, but we cannot pick L all the time, regardless of the context, because sometimes there are other competitors that can do better in terms of detecting whether we have non-stationary properties or not. Okay. So the point here is we cannot use one of those 4 tools that you saw just now all the time, regardless of the context. We have to keep on doing this over and over again. But regardless, this exercise, this power exercise, will tell you whether we have a change at all. It won't help you pinpoint. It won't help you locate the position of the change. And so to do that, our proposal is to conduct a sequence of hypothesis tests. And essentially, we are claiming that if there is a test, each dot could represent a run being scored. Now, what we are claiming is if there is a test using one of the 4 tools that you saw, if that test on the first set of 16 observations, the first set of 16 runs, tells you that things are fine, you have a stationary process, no change at all. And if a similar test on the first set of 17, right, one more, tells you that things are not fine, then a change must have happened somewhere in between the 16th and the 17th observation. Okay, that's the claim. There are a few technical details because here you're doing a sequence of tests, so your probability of type 1 error can get inflated. You have to control your false discovery rate. The problem with a null set, what if you find no changes at all? But barring those, this remains the overall idea. Okay. That's all the theory that we need. We can now apply all these to one specific problem, to one specific match. For understandable reasons, we looked into the last World Cup final between England and New Zealand because it was extremely exciting. The match ended in a tie, and the super over designed to break the tie also ended in a tie. So ultimately, England won because they scored more boundaries. So the first goal here would be to analyze both the English innings and the New Zealand innings separately to pinpoint these locations around which changes in run scoring happened. And later, a few pages down, we will combine those to get one single catchy number to describe how exciting the entire match was. Okay. So ball by ball data were collected from that source, Crick sheet, quite popular. One thing we had to do was pray a chunk of runs. That is because the point process we are dealing with, we are assuming those patterns to be non-explosive, meaning you cannot assume 2 or more runs being scored at the same point in time. So if somebody hits a 6 during the 5th ball of the innings, we would spray those 6 runs uniformly between the 4th and the 5th deliveries over 7 equi-spaced time slots. Okay. So here is that the comparison. On the vertical axis, you have the cumulative runs, like the way you would normally see. And along the horizontal axis, you have time measured in balls and deliveries. So this was a 50 over match. So we have around 300 balls and a few more because of wides and no balls. And because of the spraying, you have around 300 times 7, which is 2100 roughly, along the horizontal axis. That's where the x-axis stops for both teams. So if you focus on the maximum-based test, the R-based proposal that you saw 2 pages ago, your answers to the question, where are those changes, would be these vertical separators here and over there for New Zealand. You would notice that some of these are quite expected, maybe around 182, the one that you have around 182. That's the point in time at which Nisham got out. So the dip in run scoring around that point in time is quite expected, but there are others, maybe around time point 20, when the grand total for the team was 20, the first change point that you see right here. It's a lot more subtle. You can't quite put a reason to it. At this point in time, nobody got out. It was not because of a power play or something like that. It's hard to find a reason to it. But one possible explanation could be because the bowlers, Chris Vokes and Jofra Archer, they started bowling better lines and lengths at that point in time. That could be one reason for the dip in run scoring. Okay. So part of our overall measure of interestingness would be the proximity, would be the closeness. How close are these change points, these sets of change points across these 2 teams? Okay. And another measure, another portion of that measure of interestingness would be the amount of change for which I bootstrapped the pre-change section using the point process resampling techniques described here to figure out how New Zealand's innings would have gone had there been no change around this point in time. Okay, so the black curve is the run scoring that we actually saw, and the red is what we would have seen had Jofra Archer and Chris Vokes not found better lines and lengths. Okay, so similarities between those 2 pieces, those 2 colors, the red and the black, they will can be calculated through intensity differentials and in loads of other ways. But the point here is those numbers, the numbers that you see here, they will tell you how similar, right? These numbers are all bounded by zeros and ones. They will tell you how similar the red is to the black, okay? So the bigger these numbers are, the more similar is what you saw to what you would have seen, implying the change of the impact of that change, whatever that change was, is not that big, okay? So of course, one set of numbers won't be meaningful unless you have some context, unless you have the English innings worked out this way as well. So we're going to do just that in just a moment's time, but this is one way to quantify the magnitude of change without using any data. This is entirely data dependent. We haven't used any parametric assumptions anyway. Okay. So you would notice over here that if quite a few differences across the methods, the locations are quite different. So that begs the question, which tools to trust when? So to answer it, and also to know how this method, this sequential method, stacks up against established competitors, we need to take a look into a little more theory. Here is a quick summary. I won't spend too much time on this, but the general problem of change detection has been attacked from several fields since the 1950s, especially. One construction that proves to be extremely useful is that was introduced by Hawkins and others in 2003, where with a given sample size, they have translated the entire problem into finding several of these DKN statistics, measuring the difference between the pre and the post-change pieces for a fixed choice of K. The change point locator would be that value for K which maximizes some overall utility or which minimizes some overall loss function. There are different ways in which you can choose these two samples, DKN statistics. In the interest of time, I won't go into details, but I will indeed point you to one beautifully written review article by Trong and others, where each choice is explained along with the rationale behind that choice. So here is one graphic, one simulation graphic, just to prove how we to demonstrate how we are doing in relation to the rest. Here, the real changes were placed. The changes in the blue piece, the first generation intensity was placed at 50 at time point 50, and changes in the green portion, the second generation, the aftershock kernel, was placed at 75. You would notice that most of our competitors, the first 11 of those, they are sounding too many false alarms. Each dot represents the point in time at which a change got detected. Most of these other competitors, they are saying that we have a change prior to the actual change really happening, which is definitely a false alarm. Most of our proposals, we are Z, ZB, R, and L on this side. We are not doing that. Those would also be the tools that will give you the strongest and the clearest right-skewed clustering after those two very points, after the real change happened, okay? This experiment was done with a fixed sample size, that is with a fixed number of runs in mind. One natural worry is whether we can implement similar techniques regardless of the format. The number of runs coded in T20s, for instance, are typically smaller than the number of runs coded in the one-day international. These graphs will help you resolve that problem somewhat. Here we are not so much worried about the location of changes. We're more worried about the number of changes. K represents the actual number of changes that you have seen. So for the simulation study, K was set to 2. And here we're trying to check whether the probability of detecting the right number of changes approaches 1 asymptotically. We found that for most of our competitors, and the long-run probability decays very fast. Those are these lines. While for most of our proposals, although we are not reaching 1 all that fast, but we are not dropping either. So this demonstrates that if you stick with our proposal, then if you wait long enough, or long either in terms of time, measured in bold, or in terms of data, measured in terms of runs scored, then you will eventually pick out the right number of changes, You won't overcount or you won't undercount, okay? So basically theoretic tools to prove that the separators that you saw here, these vertical strips, the location of these changes are reliable. We have good answers, really. That's basically what you're trying to do with these simulation experiments. So with all those in mind,
Moinak, just to
yes,
interrupt
go
you,
on.
Moinak, you've got about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, totally. Yes.
Great.
We can combine those tools to define distances between two sets of change points found over two different innings. Notice here the number that we are assuming a priori, they are quite different. We cannot assume the two teams to have the same number of change points. We should not from the very beginning, which is why A and B are quite different. They need not be the same all the time. And for that precise reason, the normal measures of distances like the Euclidean distance or the correlation distance, they won't work out to be really good choices for you, which is why I focus on the Hausdorff metric, which by its very definition, it penalizes overfitting or over-segmentation. So our claim here is if the distance between these two teams turn out to be extremely tiny, then the change points from one innings are locationally very similar to the change point from the other innings. And we have an interesting game. We have an interesting match, right? I'll come back to this in just a moment, but this one, this heat map really summarizes those Hausdorff distances from the World Cup final, where you have the option of using different tests on different innings. Okay, so if you have a hot patch anywhere on this grid, then that distance between the change point sets is very large, implying a non-interesting match. Okay. Now, this box, for instance, tells you that if you apply the exponential proposal, which was one of our competitors on the New Zealand innings, and if you apply the mood option, which is again one of our competitors on the English innings, you would claim that the final from the World Cup was boring, at least more boring than what you would have found if you had applied L, the left base test, the minimum base test on both. Okay. It's interesting to know that if you pick a wrong test, meaning one of our competitors, you're likely to conclude that the match was boring with a big heat. On the other hand, if you pick one of our proposals, those are here, the first four places along the rows and along the columns, then with the cold region predominantly, you're likely to feel that the game was interesting, which again appeals to intuition. Okay. The tree diagram that you saw here clusters the 15 statistics that you saw, 4 from us and 11 from them, from our competitors, again through the Hausdorff metric. All of our proposals, especially on the English side, they are pretty close to each other. We have close agreement. That makes some kind of a sense too, because England were chasing, so they had a fixed target in mind. So their run chase was less chaotic as compared to New Zealand, who were trying to define a target. So that propagation was a little more chaotic, which is why you don't have agreement even among our proposals on that side, right? So you can, if you want, compare entire, I think, innings here on the tree that you see here. The entire tournament is summarized through the same business of Hausdorff distance finding. We had 44 matches, barring those that got washed out. So we have 88 different innings, and you will find all those 88-point process as leaves on this tree. So if your change patterns are similar to somebody else, essentially we're claiming that if you both go through twists and turns around the same similar points in time, you'll be nearby on this tree. Okay, so I found 4 main clusters shown here through the 4 different colors. And notice some of these results are pretty intuitive. This blue branch says, for instance, New Zealand's innings batting second during match 3. The third match was structurally, again, very similar in terms of change point locations, mind you, to West Indies, the way they batted during match 2, batting second. That is, they both scored roughly similar runs. They both lasted roughly similar number of overs. Okay, similar is the case over there. They both lasted 50 overs. They scored similar runs, but not the case here. Not the case here. If you notice the run differential, this is what I was mentioning at the beginning. Sometimes those measures can be a little misleading. If you notice the difference between 152 and 226, that's quite big. So you would probably say that those 2 innings are very dissimilar if they are coming from different matches, match 7 and match 43. But if you could conceptualize a match where you're putting these 2 innings together to define a fresh match, then you would if you look at the run differential, you would feel that that's a pretty boring match, but notice how long they lasted. They're pretty similar. So the change point locators, the position of those change points, they're very, very similar, and they will tell you that no, even though they are very, very different in terms of final number of runs, the way they flowed, the twists and turns they took, they're pretty similar in terms of locations and in terms of the amount of change too, okay? And finally, if you want, you can compare entire matches, which is a combination of 2 innings, that is, instead of separate innings. You may ask how interesting the final that we started off with was, not in isolation, but in relation to the entire tournament. That answer lives here. Let's see whether we can have a moving version of this. There you go. So along the, each match here is represented through a dot, through a tiny circle. And along the wall, along the vertical axis, you have the Hausdorff distance measured between the change point sets from those 2 innings that created that specific match. Remember, the smaller the distance, smaller the vertical distance, the better it is. You have a more interesting game. And along the floor, right, along the floor, you have the number of changes from those 2 innings. Again, higher those numbers, the more interesting the game. So the closer you are to this space, the closer you are to the space in 3D, the x equal to y diagonal on the floor, and simultaneously a space which is closer to the floor, the better it is in terms of having an interesting game, right? You would expect lots and lots of change points from both those innings, ideally similar numbers at similar times. That would guarantee that the match was quite interesting. So the one that we started off with, number 44, that's the last game of the tournament. That's right here, if I place my cursor carefully. Yeah, that's number 44, right? Which has a vertical distance of 339 along the wall. It is reasonably interesting, but we find, of course, there are other matches that are even more interesting. If you pick this one, for instance, number 41, which is closer to the end of the tournament. This could be a quarterfinal between South Africa and Australia. That is even more interesting than the final. And this is one conjecture that you can check whether you can sample different tournaments and you can check whether games that are expected to be very interesting, whether they live up to that expectation. Finals and the semifinals, whether they are living up to that expectation. And in contrast, if you find one of these dots at the very top near the ceiling of the room, probably this one, for instance, this features Afghanistan, so against Australia. So I mean, no disrespect to Afghanistan, but they're not as good as Australia in terms of cricket. So we would expect this match to be pretty one-sided, and that is confirmed. That is reflected through that big height along the wall, right? So this is a cool graphic that lets you compare the match that you have in mind in relation to a greater comparison. So that's really all I had for you today. That's all I had. What we found was there is a way to talk about interestingness through the proximity of these change points. The closer they are, the closer these 2 sets are, the better. The way we found out these separators, that way was quite reliable using theoretical methods. The number of change points should ideally be very, very big, should be very high. And once you find out these change points, you can do lots of other things. You can find out the run rate over that specific phase, over that specific period. And if you can want, you can use it to forecast future values to future number of runs scored, maybe during some period of play. By this, I mean that the time and failure truncation, they work reasonably well under both conditions. By that, I mean, it doesn't really matter how you end your innings, whether you run out of wickets or whether you run out of balls. It doesn't really matter. This method works almost equally good in either case. Okay. And then a few references. The first tells you all about the bidirectional proposal in greater details. That's my dissertation. Please take a look. The last would be about the bootstrapping that you saw, and this one would be the false discovery rate control. I'm always interested in meaningful collaborations. If these sound even remotely relevant to what you do, please let me know. But otherwise, thanks for listening. I'll be happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moinak. I'm going to give you a Teams round of applause.
Thank you.
So that's now appeared, and there's a few others coming through as well. Thank you for a very interesting talk. We have time for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Moinak? I have to say I'm not a big cricket fan, Moinak, but I did watch. I did watch that England-New Zealand game, and
Yeah,
for a non-cricket fan, it was exciting.
it was wonderful. Yeah. Probably that is one thing that you can do with this kind of an analysis. Like you can do a very similar thing in terms of football, soccer. I mean, so you can sample tweets. So all the things that you just saw, it's based on what you really observed during the game. This is more of an actual interestingness as opposed to a perceived interestingness. If you want to have an add-on to this analysis, you can track tweets, for instance, from spectators, the way they are writing these tweets, and then you can do a sentiment analysis on those tweets to see how the match is really being received. So you can compare a cricket match to a football match, for instance, to see why cricket is, or how is cricket doing in relation to the other games in terms of popularity. So the more interesting games you have, the more popular as if the entire game would be. So you can do that kind of a study too.
Yeah. I don't want to hug things, so if anyone who knows a bit more about cricket than me has any questions to ask, please do raise your hand and go ahead. Well, things are very quiet. So one more substantive question I'll ask you, Moinak, is economists often are interested in a couple of concepts. There's kind of the surprise, something unexpected happens and that changes things. But then there's also the suspense as well, how on the edge of your seat you are about a game. And these are somewhat distinct concepts in terms of how interesting a sporting event is, and hence how, how it might affect viewership figures, for example. I don't know if you've got any sense of ways in which you might build that in, or you have already thought about that.
Yeah, that is the direction I'm headed. So this is just a way you can start the discussion. What you can do next is you can do a time series on this. You can take one of these T20 tournaments. You can take the IPL, you can take the BBL, or you can take the English League. And you can run the analysis on all these matches, and then you can see how are they doing in terms of time as time changes. So that could be a way of confirming what you just said, whether one tournament is gaining popularity in terms of excitement. The more of these change points you have and the closer they are across the two teams, set-wise, then the more interesting the match and hence the entire tournament is. So there could be loads of ways of comparing, yes, tournaments. Yes, that could affect viewership, sponsorship. Yes.
Thanks for your response. There must be some questions out there. We've got a couple of minutes before our final talk. It could be I'm just not seeing the hands, and if you do just want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please go ahead. Well, we may be having some end of conference fatigue setting in. But thank you, Moinak. That was a really interesting talk.
That's all. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Stop sharing.
And we shall move towards, with a couple of minutes of comfort room, to our final talk, which is, I don't want to get his name wrong, Patrick Lambrix. Patrick is going to talk about not all goals being equally important, and this is our third different sport of the session. This is a study for the NHL, so ice hockey. Michael is already ready. You're on mute, Michael. I don't know if you meant to be on mute. Patrick, sorry, Patrick. There we go.
Right. There we go.
So I think we might as well, you can make a slow start to your talk. We've got about a minute before 20 past, which is roughly speaking when you would start if we kept rigorously to time. But I think we can just make a start and people can catch up if they join a little bit late. So go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, so here we go. So my name is Patrick Lambrix, work at Linköping University, and this is work together with my colleague Niklas Carlsson and our students Jon, Min-Chun, and Rabnawaz. Niklas has started in hockey analytics for a particular reason. He, as many others, have been dreaming to, at some point in time, reach this cup. This is the Stanley Cup, which is given to the winners of the NHL. So in his first try, he actually tried to play hockey in both in Sweden and in Canada. Didn't make it to the NHL, did make it to academia though, and is working in our group now. So his second try was much easier. He just went and visited the Stanley Cup. And as you see on the smile in this picture, this was equally satisfying. Once that he has managed his dream, then the next step is how to help other people reaching the Stanley Cup. And that's how he got into hockey analytics. For myself, it was actually a much easier reason. Not sure if this should be recorded, but I just wanted to be able to tell my wife that I was working when I was watching hockey. So I will give a little motivation for this work and then show some methods and results, and finally I will conclude. So on this slide, we see a box score from the Swedish league a few years ago. I had to try to find somewhere Linköping. There's a Linköping player on top, or at least on the third place. That was not so easy the last seasons. But anyhow, a few seasons ago, this happened. And what we see is a different kind of performance metrics. There are offensive metrics like the goal. You get a point when you score a goal. Assists, you get a point when you gave the last pass or the one but last pass that lead to a goal. There are the points or the total points, which are goals plus assists. And then there are a number of other offensive metrics like game-winning goals, power play goals, and so on. There are also defensive metrics, for instance, hits, how many tackles a player has performed, or how many shots a player blocked. There are metrics that try to have both an offensive and defensive component, and plus minus is one that was traditionally used, maybe a little bit less nowadays, where you get a point when your team scores when you're on the ice, and you get -1 point when the opposing team scores when you're on the ice. And there are some other metrics as well. So in this talk, I will come back to goals, assists, points, and plus minus. The last years, a number of more advanced metrics have shown up. For instance, is Corsi, which focuses on shots, and there are different variants. For instance, you can have shots on goal, shots for your own team, which is Corsi 4, shots by the opponent team, which is Corsi against, and different adjusted metrics as well. And Corsi is interesting because it is a better predictor for future goal differential than the actual past goal differential is. Another new measure that is being used is expected goals, which assigns a value to each shot based on the likelihood that the shot results in a goal. And here's some context is taken into account, for instance, where the shot comes from. And it has a similar predicting force as the Corsi for future goal differential. These metrics have made it into ice hockey discourse, so you do hear about Corsi and expected goals in the hockey shows on TV. There are some more advanced performance metrics, which try to deal with a critique of the traditional ones, which is that context is not taken so much into account yet. And there are some newer approaches using, for instance, Markov games or Tor, which takes different kinds of events into account. And although these are actually very interesting metrics, they may not have made it into the hockey discourse so much yet. So for instance, there is a metric by the Schulte Group in a Canadian university, which has shown that their metric correlates heavily with quite a lot of the offensive metrics that are traditionally used. But we haven't seen it yet in the TV programs, for instance. So what we wanted to do in this paper is define some metrics that are variants of the traditional metrics. And we look at goals, assists, points, and plus minus. Hopefully, as there are variants on traditional metrics, they will be easy to understand for practitioners, for the coaches, for the general managers. We do want to take into account context, and we'll define the context later on. And they're also going to be related to goals, so they're goal-based measures, and they're going to be related to the importance of goals. Now we have to define what this importance means, but intuitively it's clear that when you score a goal, when the score is 1-1 in the last seconds, this is going to be an important goal. Your team is going to have a chance to win. While if you score a goal when the score is already 6-0, maybe that exact goal is not that important. We also know that there are players who are known to score mainly in easy games where the opponents are not that strong, while there are other players who are known to step up when the team is, for instance, trailing. And one of these players that are known for that is, for instance, Ovechkin. During the 2013-14 season that we look at mainly in this paper, he was only 29th for scoring when his team was in the lead, but he was first in the league for lead-taking goals and game-tying goals. So he is known to make important goals. So let us look at the methods and results. The data that we use is play-by-play data provided by SportLogic, which was made available online by the Schulte Group. In the paper, we only look at the 2013-2014 season, but we have some newer results for 6 additional seasons, which I will show later on. And we only look at the regular season, so not the playoffs. An interesting observation about goals is that goals are scored, the number of goals that are scored are differently in different times of the game. So for instance, in the beginning of the game, not so many goals are scored, while in the last minute of the game, 3 times more goals are scored than in any other minute of the game. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign to a goal within a context a game point importance value. Game points are the points that are used by the NHL to rank the teams. So you get 2 points for a win, 1 point for a tie, and then a loss after overtime, and 0 points for a loss in regulation time. We call them game points in this paper to distinguish them from the points, which are the performance metric, which are goals plus assists. So we'll need 2 things to define this game points importance value. First of all, we need to say what is the outcome, and we look only at regulation time, so you can have a win, a tie, or a loss. And then we define what the context is. So we will define a context as a triple consisting of time, which will be measured in seconds, a goal differential, which is the number of goals of the home team minus the number of goals of the away team. So if the score is 5-2, then the goal differential is +3. And then there's the manpower differential, which has to do with how many skaters there are on the ice. When some players make faults, they get into the penalty box. So you can have even strength, where the manpower differential is 0, but then you can also have +1 or +2, which is a power play, or -1, -2, which is a box play. So given outcome and context, we can now define what is the probability of an outcome, a win, tie, or loss, given a context, so a specific time, goal differential, and manpower differential. And we define that based on the play-by-play data. We look how many times this context occurs given that outcome, and we divide it by how often this context occurs. So once we have this, we can actually define the game point importance value for a goal in the context. We use context AG and context BG for context after the goal and context before the goal. Now, these contexts are similar in the sense that the time, the second, will be the same. The goal differential will differ by 1 because 1 goal is scored. And the manpower differential could be the same or could be different. So if it's an even strength goal, it will be the same before and after the goal. But in case there's a power play for minor penalties, this may be, the manpower differential may change. So the game point's important value for a context, and this context is then the same as the context before the goal. To compute this, first we look at the probability of winning, given the context after the goal, minus the probability of winning, given the context before the goal. So essentially, it's the change of probability of winning the game by scoring the goal. We do the same for a tie. So we look at the change of probability of the game ending in a tie by scoring this goal. And then we take into account that winning gives you 2 points and tying gives you 1 point. And the game point's importance value is then the sum of these terms. So let us have a look at some of the properties of this new value. Here we have a slide which shows the game point's important values in relation to the goal differential. So the green color is for positive values, the red color for negative values. The darker the green, the higher the value of the game point's importance value, and the darker the red, the more negative value we have. So we can look at the goal differential 0, so the middle line. Here we have a bit darker green, and this is clear. When the goal differential is 0 and you score a goal, then you're going into the lead and you're going to gain more points, probably. Then we have the third period. We see that goals in the third period are usually more important. This also makes sense. If we look more closely in the third period, where the goal differential is -1, we have some darker areas. And this means that if you were trailing the game in the third period, at the end of the third period, and now you score a goal, you're tying the game. So better chance for points. And we also see a little darker area when the goal differential is 1. And this also makes sense. So you had a 1-goal lead, and now you have a 2-goal lead after scoring a goal. So the probability of winning is higher. Maybe we would have expected a bit more darker green towards the end of the 0 and the end of the third period. Because obviously if you score a goal when the goal differential is 0, then you go from tying the game to taking the lead. But the reason it's not that dark is, as we saw before, that actually in the last minute, 3 times more goals are scored than in any other minute. So it's not as dark as we would expect. We also see a red spot on the diagram. And this is when the goal differential is 2 early on in the game. So for instance, you're leading 2-0 and you score at the 3-0 goal. And this may actually have a negative effect for winning the game. And there is this saying that 3-0 lead early in the game is a bit dangerous. Maybe because the team is starting to slack off quite early in the game then. And the data for this season actually seems to support this. When we look at the manpower differential versus the game points importance value, we see that there is not such a huge influence, except for when the manpower differential was -2 or +2, both in a negative sense and in the positive sense. When we look at the distribution function, actually the possibility of getting a negative reward or negative game points importance value is not that high. So only 2% of the cases you would get a negative game points importance value. Most of the values are between 0 and 0.5. This is about 82%. And then the rest is from 0.5 to 1.62. Now, this above 0.5 is interesting because you could think about what happens if a game goes in overtime. There is a slight home advantage, but the possibility to actually win the game, so score the sudden death goal and win the game, is about 0.5, which means that the value of such a goal could be about 0.5 and getting 1 point. Importance value is about 0.5, get 1 point. So everything a score above 0.5 in this for this game points importance value are really important goals. So given this new value, we're going to define new metrics. So what we know in the traditional metrics is that usually a goal contributes 1 directly to, for instance, goals. If you score a goal, you get +1. It also contributes directly to plus-minus. If your team scores a goal, you get +1 point for the plus-minus. And of course, you need to score a goal to have an assist. So 1 goal can give you 1 point in the assist league as well. Now, what we're going to do here is to create variants of goals, assist points, and plus-minus, where the goal does not contribute with 1, but with its context-based game point importance value. So one way to check whether this makes sense is to do the eye test and see whether this has any repercussion on how the players score in the different rankings. So here's an example of the points ranking in supplementary material that we've put online. You also will find the rankings for the other performance metrics. So the first column gives you the rank according to the traditional points. The second column according to the new kinds of points. Then we have the rank difference, the player, the position the player plays, and then the actual points and the game ports importance value based points. Now what we see is Alex Ovechkin, which we said before was a player that usually makes important goals, is actually going from rank 4 to rank 2, and considering high up this is in the ranking, this is quite a substantial change. We also see at the bottom Blake Wheeler, Anze Kopitar, and Eric Stahl, that they have moved up quite a bit in the rankings. And we see that also for other players that could get into the top 30. These are players which we know are scoring quite a bit in the playoffs, where goals are tougher to make. Or they're usually well-known, strong two-way players, both defensively and offensively. Or they're players that have the reputation of being game changers. In this picture, we see the rank changes. At the x-axis, we have the rank according to the traditional points, goals, assists. And on the y-axis, we have the rank according to the new kinds of goals, points, goals, and assists. The players in green are improving their rank. The players in red are having a lower rank, and the players in blue, they keep their rank. And we see that actually there are quite some players that were not in the top 30 again, according to the original points, but they do get into the top 30 now with the new kind of points. So there are definitely changes within the ranking system. So I'll show you some new results which are not in the paper yet, and these have to do with the other seasons as well. So in addition to the eye test, another way to check relevance of new metrics is to look at the correlations towards the traditional metrics. And for these 7 seasons, we see that for the assists, goals, and the points, the correlation is quite high between the traditional metric and the new metric. For the plus-minus value, this is not so much the case. And this we also see when we actually plot the correlations over the different seasons. Here we have the goals versus the game points importance value-based goals, where we see a clear correlation, but differences. Similarly for the assists, for the points, and as we would expect, a bit less for the plus-minus. And it seems that for the points, the correlation is the highest, actually. So here's some anecdotal evidence. We haven't looked clearly yet at trends over the different seasons. As I said, these results are quite fresh. And here are just 3 players because we happen to like these players, Chara, Thornton, and Ovechkin. And what we see over the seasons is that, at least for the goals, assists, and the points, when a player has a lower performance in one of these rankings, they will also have a lower performance in the game points importance value based rankings. And they seem to follow each other quite well. So the correlation is there again, and that is what we see. So let me conclude. We have introduced variants of these traditional metrics, and these take the importance of goals into account, where the importance is defined based on contribution of probability of gaining 1 or 2 points for the game. There is a strong correlation for the goals, assists, and points between the new and the traditional metrics. However, there are also differences, and this is what makes it interesting, because now you can compare players that may be similar in the points league, but you can distinguish between which of these players makes important goals and which one makes not so important goals. And it seems that these new metrics also pass the eye test. So in future work, we want to analyze the different season a bit deeper. And we also want to use this game point importance value in more complex performance metrics. For instance, the one from the Schulte group, we have worked further on this, and we presented this in Mathsport 2 years ago. That is a Markov model-based approach where Q value is learned by a Q learning algorithm. And in this Q learning algorithm, you give rewards to goals. And the rewards that are given there are 1. And here we want to use the game points important value instead of this 1 and see what happens then. So in this case, this is used for defining the value of an action, and then the player is evaluated based on the actions that he performs or the actions that are performed when the player is on the ice. So this is my talk. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for a very interesting talk. And it's worth saying that that's also a reason why I do the economics of sport, is to justify watching sport a lot to my wife. So on to questions coming in. We have Niklas asking you a question.
Hi, how are you? Very interesting talk. I have 2 questions regarding the work. One is, maybe I missed it, how did you calculate the chance of winning after a goal was scored? And the second one, if there were any insights maybe at team level or maybe also watching playoffs. I'm thinking, for example, the example of the Toronto Maple Leafs, which had a wonderful regular seasons over the years, but they continue to fail in the postseason?
Yes. So the way that probabilities were counted was by looking at the play-by-play data. For every second, we checked what the context was. So what was the goal differential? What was the manpower differential? So for every goal that happened, we looked in which second it was and what the context was before and after the goal. And then we checked what the outcome of the actual game was. And then we summarized this for all the different games in the regular season.
Great, thanks.
Then this is a player-based performance measure, so we haven't gone up to the teams. But regarding playoffs, what we would expect is that people who are higher up in the rankings according to our metric versus a traditional metric are going to be players who are doing well in the playoffs. This seems to be something that we have seen, but we didn't do the math yet.
Great, thanks. Very interesting.
Thank you. We next have a question from Alex.
Well, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I really like those types of indexes. But I will repeat the question, I guess, with regard to the playoffs, because you value the win by 2 points, a draw by 1, and a loss by 0. But I guess in playoffs it's a bit different. It's also function of what is the current score of the overall playoff, right? The tie between the teams. So how would you do it then?
Yes, so I agree. This is the first step towards such a metric. We may have to look at deeper what happens for the playoffs. We also didn't look yet at, we didn't add a component for the overtime, even in the regular season. And of course, being a fan of the Swedish league as well, there you have 3 points for a win, 2 points for an overtime win, 1 point for an overtime loss, and 0 points for a regulation time loss. So the formula probably needs to be adapted based on the league and based on whether it's regular season and playoffs.
But do you have any idea how to do it with playoffs? Because 2-1-0, 3-2-1.
Yeah. So yes, there is also something that it doesn't matter so much whether it's a 5-0 win or a 1-0 win in the playoffs, right? Yeah, I must say I haven't thought about how to do it yet, but it's definitely on our list.
Thanks, Alex. Any more questions? That looks like a no, and I'm afraid, not being a particularly strong aficionado of ice hockey, I don't have any questions myself either. So what I'll do then is I will say thank you, Patrick. That was a very interesting talk, even for the non-ice hockey fan. And thank you for questions. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions. That concludes the 8th Mathsport International Conference. The first one that was unfortunately had to be entirely virtual in its nature, which is unfortunately a function of the pandemic. So thank you everyone who has made it this far through the conference. It's meant that we've been able to meet from afar, which is certainly good in the sense that we have actually been able to meet rather than simply not be able to meet at all. So we've certainly been able to, with participants spanning the entire globe, make advantage of that. So thank you everybody for contributing from your various parts of the world. I'm going to quickly share a PowerPoint slide just to give you a sense of what we hope will be next year's version of the conference. And I give my apologies because my computer is rather slow. Let's go into a full screen from there. This is a slide to say, hopefully we can see you in person next year. Hopefully we can meet in person next year. We have provisional dates set for next year's Mathsport International 9, moving on 1 year rather than the usual 2, since we've not been able to meet physically since 2019. And the plan is to meet in Reading. So there I've given you a number of photos, choice photos of the beautiful campuses that we have at the University of Reading. And the provisional date is to meet on July the 11th to the 13th of next year. And that's particularly chosen to coincide with the UEFA Women's Football Championships, which will be in England next year. And there will be games in the southeast of England, so in the near vicinity of Reading. So please do mark your diaries ahead of time. We hope it can be in person, and as and when we get closer to the time, we'll start to firm up plans for the 2022 variant, Mathsport 9, and you'll hopefully find a call for papers. So in the meantime, thank you everybody for your contributions. I will just check back and make sure that there aren't any. Dries is part of my organising committee, so I don't know if Dries has any final comments that he would wish to make before we close the conference.
Well, I might be part of the organizing committee, but let me stress that James actually did all the work. So let me thank James for organizing this conference. I think everything went quite smoothly. Of course, online conferences have their disadvantages. One particular disadvantage, I would say, was the quality of the lunches, which was much worse than other Mathsport editions. But apart from that, I think everything went very well. And it's not obvious. I mean, some time ago when James agreed to organize this conference, it was of course intended as an on-location conference, but James has been very flexible with the COVID pandemic to organize this online conference as well, on top of the on-site conference, which is coming up next year. So we get 2 conferences for the price of 1, and this one especially was very cheap. So that's all very great. Thanks, James. Very well done.
Thanks, Dries, and thanks everybody. And now we can go back to enjoying the European Championships.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Dries. Take care. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Cheers, Alan.
Thank you. Go Ukraine.